The shove came so hard that Reed Harlan's shoulder struck the brass edge of the service counter, rattling a row of white coffee cups in their saucers. But what frightened the room was not the sound. It was the way he steadied himself afterward. No curse, no flinch, no wild swing of his fist, no show of injured pride. He only placed the wire strippers he had been holding onto a folded towel, turned his head, and looked at Derek Hollis with the calm, distant focus of a man listening to thunder from miles away. The lounge inside the Marlowe Hotel had gone quiet in pieces, table by table, until even the espresso machine seemed to hiss more softly behind the bar. Derek, red-faced and breathing through his nose, lifted his hand again as if the first shove had not been enough to prove whatever cruel point he thought he was making. Reed's jacket was faded at the elbows, his boots were scuffed from shop floors and winter salt, and a strip of blue painter's tape clung to one knee of his jeans. To everyone who had looked at him for half a second and then looked away, he was only the repairman who had wandered too close to important people. But when Derek stepped forward, Reed spoke in a voice so low that the words seemed to settle directly into the floorboards. "That's the last time you touch me." Nobody in the room knew that the man they had laughed at had once carried a wounded teammate through a burning stairwell in Basra with 2 cracked ribs and no working radio. Nobody knew that he could read a security grid faster than most executives could read a contract. Nobody knew he had spent the last 7 years raising a little girl alone in a narrow brick rental on the south side of St. Louis, choosing quiet work and early mornings over recognition, because recognition had never fed his child or brought back the life he had lost. Across the room, Vivian Hartwell, president of Hartwell Aerosecure, slowly lowered the leather folder in her hands. She had come to the Marlowe for a private strategy lunch, not a revelation. Yet in the silence after Reed's warning, something in her careful, disciplined mind began rearranging itself. The man in the worn jacket did not look angry. He looked restrained. And there is a kind of restraint that only exists in people who have already survived the worst thing another person can do to them. The Marlowe's West Lounge was the sort of place where wealthy travelers held their phones away from their faces and spoke as though the room owed them privacy. Copper lamps hung low over marble tables. The windows framed the gray Mississippi distance beyond downtown rooftops. On most afternoons, the lounge smelled of dark roast, lemon oil, and rain drying from expensive coats. But that Thursday carried an extra stiffness because Vivian had reserved the back half for a final review before Hartwell's largest federal logistics contract of the decade. She arrived without drama, as she always did, in a charcoal coat and low heels, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck and her expression composed enough to make nervous people stand straighter. At 41, she had inherited neither her father's volume nor his taste for intimidation. She led by asking precise questions and remembering every answer. Her company built encrypted routing systems for emergency aircraft, medical supply chains, and disaster response units, which meant mistakes did not merely cost money. In the wrong season, in the wrong hurricane, a mistake could cost lives. Derek Hollis, her senior operations director, followed her in with a laugh too large for the room and a silver watch he checked whenever someone else spoke. He had the polished ease of a man who considered himself indispensable. And for several years, many people had agreed with him because Derek was talented when watched and ruthless when not. He knew how to compliment board members, how to scold assistants just softly enough that outsiders missed it, how to take credit in a room where the person who had done the work had been taught not to interrupt. Vivian had tolerated his arrogance longer than she liked to admit, because he produced results and because there was always another crisis requiring attention. That was the kind of excuse powerful people made until the day the excuse stood in front of them and shoved somebody smaller. Reed had been at the Marlowe since 7 that morning because Nora Bell, the lounge manager, trusted him more than she trusted the hotel's preferred vendor. A breaker behind the coffee station had been tripping, whenever the warming drawers and the under-counter dishwasher ran at the same time, and Nora had called him before dawn, apologizing before he even answered. Reed had listened in his kitchen while packing his daughter's lunch. Turkey on wheat, apple slices, the last strawberry yogurt, and a note folded into the shape of a crooked star because Junie liked finding surprises between napkins. "I can come after school drop-off," he had told Nora, "but I have to be across town by 3:15. Nora understood. Everybody who knew Reed understood that 3:15 mattered because Junie came out of Southgate Elementary at 3:28, and Reed Harlan was never late unless blood or weather stopped him. He had lost his wife, Lila, to an aneurysm when Junie was 4, and since then he had built his life around alarms. Wake at 5, pack lunch, braid hair if Junie's hands were too sleepy, work wherever work could be found, answer the school nurse on the first ring, put dinner on the table even if dinner was eggs and toast, check homework, read one chapter, lock the door twice. He did not speak about hardship as though it were noble. He simply carried it. That morning, he wore the canvas jacket Lila had bought him from a farm supply store years before, its zipper repaired with a paper clip and its left pocket holding a tiny plastic horse Junie had pressed into his palm before school. "For luck," she had said, serious as a judge. He had smiled, tucked it away, and promised he would bring it home safe. By noon, the panel was open, the fault was identified, and Reed was kneeling behind the service counter, while Vivian's executives took their seats 20 feet away, with tablets, coffee, and the unquestioned assumption that the room existed for them. Derek noticed Reed because men like Derek always noticed the person easiest to diminish. At first, it was only a glance. Boots, tool bag, jacket, hair beginning to gray at the temples, no badge clipped to a lapel. Then the glance hardened into opportunity. Vivian had just asked about the readiness report for the Denver demonstration when Derek leaned back in his chair and said loudly, "Are we really holding a confidential contract review with some handyman crawling around behind the bar?" The word handyman landed with a little shine on it, meant to amuse. 2 junior directors smiled because Derek was smiling. Nora, who had been arranging cups near the machine, turned pale and stepped forward. She explained that Reed was cleared by hotel management, that the issue was electrical, that he had done work for the Marlowe before and never so much as looked at a guest's paperwork. Derek did not let her finish. "I'm sure he's a prince," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "But some of us are discussing matters above the pay grade of a man with a screwdriver." Reed kept one hand inside the panel and tightened the neutral bar screw a quarter turn, his face unreadable. He had heard worse in loading bays, in parking lots, in VA offices where exhausted clerks called numbers instead of names. Pride was expensive. He saved his for Junie. Still, when Derek added, "Maybe hurry it up. I assume you've got a radiator to fix somewhere before your parole officer checks in." Something moved behind Reed's eyes. Not anger exactly, but a door briefly opening onto a darker room. Vivian saw it because she had been trained by years of negotiation to watch the smallest changes. Reed did not answer. He only tested the load again, marked the breaker with a pencil, and said to Nora, "You're safe on this line now. I'll clean up and get out of your way." His tone held no sarcasm. That irritated Derek more than any insult could have, because a man determined to tower over someone cannot bear it when the other person refuses to crouch. Derek stood, smoothing the front of his suit coat with both hands. "No," he said. "You don't just skulk around a private meeting, make everyone uncomfortable, and walk off like you did us a favor." Reed closed the panel and began winding his meter leads. The lounge had changed by then. People were pretending to look at menus while listening with their whole bodies. Vivian's chief counsel, Marisol Keene, had gone still near the window, one finger resting on the edge of her legal pad. Vivian should have stopped it then, and later she would remember that fact with shame. But in the moment she watched 1 second too long, curious about the quiet man, and settled by Derek's ugliness. Derek stepped into Reed's path, apologized to Ms. Hartwell for disrupting her meeting. Reed lifted his eyes. "I didn't disrupt it. You're doing it now. I was asked to fix a hazard. You were asked to know your place." The sentence struck the room harder than Derek seemed to expect. Nora whispered his name, half warning, half plea. Reed looked down at the tool bag in his hand and then pulled Derek toward the exit, measuring distance the way another man might measure weather. "I have a school pickup," he said. "Move aside." Derek laughed once, sharp and ugly. "Of course you do. Some kid waiting in a rusted-out van, proud as anything because Dad spent the day begging for odd jobs." The plastic horse in Reed's pocket pressed against his thigh as he shifted his weight. For the first time, his jaw tightened. He still did not raise his voice. "Leave my daughter out of your mouth." Derek mistook that sentence for weakness because it contained pain. He put both hands on Reed's chest and shoved. The impact was brief, almost clumsy, but it broke whatever polite lie had been holding the room together. Reed's shoulder clipped the counter. A cup jumped, tipped, and would have shattered if Reed's left hand had not caught it by the handle without looking. The motion was so clean that several people missed it until the cup was already steady on its saucer again. Derek flushed deeper. He had expected stumbling, maybe pleading, maybe a flash of temper he could use. Reed gave him none of it. He set the cup down, then laid his tools beside it one by one, each small sound clear in the silence. When Derek lifted his hand a second time, Reed's warning came, quiet and final. For half a breath, Derek hesitated. Then humiliation pushed him forward. He grabbed Reed's jacket collar with both fists and yanked. Reed did not punch him. He did not throw him against a table or make a spectacle of strength. His right hand rose, turned, and folded Derek's wrist inward at an angle that made the larger man's knees soften instantly. With his other hand, Reed guided Derek down rather than letting him fall, pinning him against the edge of a chair just long enough for Derek's grip to break. It was over so quickly that the room seemed to realize it only after Derek was already gasping, one knee on the rug, his watch twisted sideways on his wrist. Reed released him at once and stepped back, palms open, breathing evenly. "Enough," Reed said. Derek scrambled up with a strangled sound. "He attacked me!" he shouted, pointing at Reed as if volume could edit memory. "You all saw that. This man assaulted a Hartwell executive." Nobody answered. Vivian turned toward Nora. "The cameras cover this area?" Nora nodded, shaken. "Every angle except the restroom hall. Pull the last 10 minutes. Derek's face changed so quickly that Vivian almost missed it. Outrage first, then calculation, then the first faint line of fear. Reed bent to pick up his tool bag. "I'm done here." Vivian stopped him with his name, though she had not been introduced. "Mr. Harlan," he looked back. "Please stay until we review the footage." His expression suggested he had no appetite for vindication. "Ma'am, I have a daughter who worries when I'm late." That sentence, more than the wrist lock or the warning, pierced Vivian's composure. It did not sound like an excuse. It sounded like the center of his life. Nora brought the footage up on the lounge office monitor, and the little crowd that gathered watched the truth replay in cold blue light. Derek's mockery had no charm without the living force of his confidence around it. The shove looked worse on camera, more deliberate, more childish. Reed's response looked exactly as it had been. Controlled, limited, almost merciful. Vivian watched once, then he asked Nora to play it again from the beginning. The second viewing did not soften anything. Derek began explaining before anyone asked him to. He spoke about workplace safety, unpredictable contractors, public perception, his obligation to protect Vivian, his belief that Reed had been looming. The excuses piled up like wet paper. Reed stood near the door, one hand on the strap of his bag, looking less like a victorious man than a tired one. Marisol Keene watched him with narrowing eyes, not suspiciously, but with the frustration of a memory refusing to surface. "Harlan," she murmured. "Reed Harlan." He heard her and lowered his gaze. Before she could say more, the lounge lights flickered. The coffee machine clicked off. Somewhere behind the wall, a relay chattered in a quick metallic stutter. Nora swore under her breath. Derek seized on the distraction. "See? This is exactly what happens when you hire bargain help." Reed had already turned toward the panel. "Nobody touched that outlet." His voice carried now. Not louder, just different, and every staff member obeyed before knowing why. He set his bag down, opened the panel again, and traced the fault in under a minute. A secondary bypass had been switched off and reloaded improperly, likely by someone trying to kill power to the visible work area without understanding the shared circuit. The surge would have fried the machine and possibly started a fire in the wall if the old breaker had held instead of tripping. Reed corrected it with steady hands while Derek watched, mouth tight, his insult dying without ceremony. Vivian noticed the speed of Reed's assessment, the way he scanned labels, wire age, heat discoloration, and access points as if reading a familiar language. This was not a man who merely fixed loose outlets. When power returned and the machine hummed back to life, Nora looked ready to cry from relief. Reed only checked his watch. "I need to leave." Marisol stepped closer. "Did you ever consult for a company called Northline Recovery under a sealed vendor file?" Reed's hand stilled on the zipper of his bag. Vivian turned toward her counsel. Marisol's voice softened. 3 years ago, Hartwell almost lost the wildfire evacuation routing platform. Someone rebuilt our compromised access architecture overnight and refused attribution. The invoice came through Northline. The field name was R. Harlan. Reed's face closed, not in guilt but discomfort. That job was supposed to stay quiet. Vivian stared at him. That unseen rescue had saved her company from public failure and, more importantly, had kept emergency flight routes online across 4 states during fire season. She had approved a bonus for every department involved without ever learning that the decisive work had been done by a man now standing in front of her in a torn jacket because her own executive had shoved him. Reed left before the conversation could turn him into a monument. He signed Nora's work order, refused free coffee because he had already had enough attention for one day, and drove his 12-year-old pickup across town with 7 minutes to spare. At Southgate Elementary, Junie came out in a purple coat with one sleeve half inside out, her backpack bouncing against her knees, her dark curls escaping the braid he had done badly that morning. She ran until she remembered she was 10 and trying to be dignified, then slowed to a brisk walk. "You brought Henry back?" she asked as soon as she climbed in, meaning the plastic horse. Reed pulled it from his pocket and placed it in her mittened hand. He supervised a complicated job. Junie inspected the toy's chipped blue saddle. Did he behave? Better than some grown-ups. She looked up quickly because children who have lost one parent learn to read the other with terrible accuracy. "Did someone give you trouble?" Reed started the truck and let the engine warm before answering. "A man forgot his manners." "Did you remind him?" For the first time all day, Reed almost smiled. "A little." They stopped at the pharmacy for Junie's inhaler, and Reed counted bills at the counter while pretending not to notice the price had gone up again. That was the part of his life no boardroom ever saw, the arithmetic of survival. Which bill could wait? Which tire could last another month? Whether he could take the Saturday warehouse shift without missing Junie's science fair setup? He had skills that could have earned him a corner office if he wanted one, but corner offices came with exposure, questions, old records, people digging through a service history sealed for good reasons and bad ones. After Lila died, Reed had chosen work that let him disappear by 3:15. He cooked spaghetti that night while Junie built a cardboard model of a river lock system on the kitchen table. He listened to her explain water pressure, gate timing, and why her teacher, Mrs. Voss, said she had engineering instincts. He did not tell her that a stranger had mocked her existence to hurt him. He did not tell her that an executive had placed hands on him and then lied. He did not tell her that Vivian Hartwell knew his name now. Some truths were too heavy for a child's dinner plate. Derek did not go home to regret anything. He went home to manage the story. By 10 that night, 3 Hartwell managers had received carefully worded messages describing an unprovoked physical incident involving an outside repairman with concerning tactical training. By morning, a board member had heard that Vivian had been placed at risk by lax venue controls. Someone in communications was asked to prepare a contingency statement. Someone in vendor management was told to review the Marlowe relationship. Derek called Nora directly and spoke in the gentle voice men use when threatening someone whose rent depends on goodwill. He suggested that memories could be complicated, that camera angles did not show intent, that Hartwell's corporate events were valuable to the hotel, and that Reed Harlan was hardly worth protecting. Nora hung up on him with shaking hands and then called Vivian's office. That call mattered. So did the next 6. Vivian spent Friday doing what she should have done months earlier, listening to people who had been waiting for permission to be honest. Assistants described Derek's temper. Junior analysts described credit stolen, warnings buried, security exceptions approved without documentation. A logistics coordinator admitted that Derek had ordered her to disable a vendor verification step on several late-night data transfers, claiming Vivian had authorized it. She had not. By late afternoon, Marisol had assembled a timeline that made the lounge incident look less like a sudden lapse and more like the visible tip of something rotten. Vivian sat alone in her office after sunset, the city turning black and gold beyond the glass, and watched the footage again without sound. Reed stepping back. Reed opening his palms. Reed saying he had a daughter waiting. The guilt came not as melodrama, but as a clean, unpleasant fact. She had mistaken composure for harmlessness, cruelty for management style, and silence for consent. Her father, dead 5 years now, had built Hartwell on a sentence he repeated whenever a contract became difficult. Systems reveal character under stress. Vivian had applied that principle to machines, networks, storms, fuel routes. She had not applied it nearly enough to people. On Monday morning, Reed received a formal request to appear at Hartwell's headquarters. He almost ignored it. The email was polite, direct, and signed by Vivian herself, asking him to attend a closed review regarding Derek's complaint and offering transportation, compensation for his time, and assurance that the meeting would end before school pickup. That last detail told him more than the rest. He drove himself anyway. Hartwell's headquarters stood west of the city in a campus of glass, limestone, and carefully planted sycamores, the kind of place where even the security gates looked designed by architects. Reed parked between a new electric sedan and a black SUV, looked down at his jacket, and considered leaving. Then he thought of Junie watching him from the school auditorium later that week, waiting beside her cardboard lock system, believing her father always did the steady thing. He went inside. The receptionist's smile faltered when she saw him. 2 men near the elevators glanced at his boots. In the conference center, a dozen executives and board members sat around a long table with Derek at the far end, looking rested and righteous, as though he had rehearsed innocence in the mirror until it fit his face. Vivian sat at the center, Marisol to her right. Reed chose the chair nearest the door. Derek began immediately, not by apologizing, but by expressing concern. He spoke of threats, optics, liability, trauma to staff, the need to protect female leadership from volatile outsiders. Each phrase was polished enough to sound noble if heard from the hallway. Reed said nothing. He had learned in uniform and in grief that people often reveal more when allowed to continue. When Derek finished, Vivian nodded once to Marisol, and the full lounge recording filled the wall screen. This time there was no espresso hiss, no social pressure, no flattering angle. Just Derek's voice, Derek's shove, Derek's hands on Reed's collar, and Reed ending the threat without injury. The room grew very still. One board member removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Another looked down at the table as if ashamed of having arrived with an opinion. Derek tried to recover. His response demonstrates exactly my concern. That was trained force. It was restraint, Marisol said. There is a difference. Vivian turned to Reed. Will you tell us where that restraint was learned? Reed's eyes moved briefly toward the window. I served. In what capacity? He exhaled, not annoyed, only weary of opening locked doors. Joint recovery and technical operations, Air Force attachment, later contract security on infrastructure failures. Derek gave a humorless laugh. Conveniently vague. Marisol tapped her laptop. Colonel Callum Tate is on the secure line. The screen changed to the face of an older man with close-cropped white hair and the heavy, unsentimental gaze of someone who had spent his life deciding what fear could and could not be allowed to do. He confirmed Reed's service. He confirmed commendations that Reed had never framed, injuries he had never discussed, and a classified extraction in which Reed had remained behind to reroute communications after a betrayal in the command chain left his team exposed. Harlan took blame that belonged above him, Tate said, his voice roughening slightly. Not because he was guilty, because if he fought it publicly, 3 younger men with families would have been dragged through hearings for following orders they had every reason to trust. He walked away with a damaged record and a clean conscience. That should tell you what kind of man you have in that room. Reed stared at the table. Praise seemed to cost him more than insult. The meeting might have ended there with Derek disgraced, but truth sometimes arrives in layers, each one heavier than the last. As Vivian began to speak, every screen along the conference wall flashed amber. A security alert pulsed across the main display, then another, then a cascade of red system notices that erased the paused video of the lounge. A young network engineer burst through the side door without knocking. Ms. Hartwell, we have unauthorized movement inside the emergency routing environment. It's active now. Vivian was already standing. Containment status? Partial. They're using an internal exception path. We close one route and they pivot to another. The room changed instantly. Executives who had been moral judges 30 seconds earlier became frightened employees watching the foundation of their company shake. The federal demonstration was scheduled for 2 o'clock. The system under attack contained simulated routing data, contract validation materials, and proprietary failover protocols. If it was locked, leaked, or corrupted, Hartwell could lose not only the contract but the trust of agencies that depended on them during floods, fires, and mass evacuations. Derek rose too quickly, knocking his pen to the floor. Get the cyber team on it. They are on it, the engineer said. That's why I'm here. Vivian moved toward the operations room, and the others followed in a broken line. Reed remained seated for 1 second, telling himself this was no longer his fight. Then he saw on the display a pattern of access requests repeating in clusters of 7, a rhythm that pulled an old memory from him like a hook. Not random, not brute force. Someone had opened a narrow door and marked it as maintenance traffic. He stood. You're looking at the wrong layer. The engineer stopped. "Excuse me." Reed pointed to the screen. "That's not an outside breach pushing in. That's an inside credential handing packets to an outside listener. Check your building automation bridge, then the vendor sandbox." Derek snapped. "He has no authority here." Vivian looked at Reed. "Can you help?" "Yes." "Then you have authority from me." The operations room was colder than the conference room, bright with monitors and the controlled panic of people typing too fast. Reed took the temporary terminal they gave him, asked for read-only logs first, then requested elevated access only after showing exactly what he planned to isolate. That mattered to Vivian. He did not grab power just because emergency made it available. He earned each step. Within minutes, the room began to follow his cadence. He identified a dormant maintenance account reactivated the previous night, a disabled alert rule, a file transfer disguised as HVAC telemetry, and a timed credential refresh that would have locked Hartwell's own engineers out at 1:40 p.m. "Who approved the exception?" Vivian asked. The engineer swallowed. "Operations director level." Everyone knew what that meant before the name appeared. Derek Hollis. Derek went white, then furious. "My credentials were cloned." Reed did not turn around. "Maybe." He pulled up another log. "But the exception was approved from your office terminal at 11:18 last night, then confirmed by your phone token 12 seconds later. Badge records show you entered the building at 11:03 and left at 11:29. Derek's mouth opened. No sound came out. Reed continued working because the system still mattered more than the man unraveling behind him. He severed the false maintenance path, quarantined the transfer node, restored the alert rule, and handed the keyboard back to Hartwell's lead engineer before anyone could mistake him for someone seeking command. "You have your environment," he said. "Rotate all director-level credentials before 2. Derek's collapse was not dramatic at first. It began with denial, then outrage, then the pleading logic of a cornered man insisting that technical evidence could be misunderstood by people too eager for a villain. But Marisol had already called corporate security, and Vivian had already ordered preservation of every log, badge record, and message. As the minutes passed, pieces arrived from other departments. Unexplained payments to a consulting LLC registered in Delaware, late-night calls to an executive at a rival contractor, deleted emails recovered from archive, internal complaints that had stalled on Derek's desk and gone nowhere. The room watched him shrink under the weight of facts. Finally, when security asked him to step away from the workstation and surrender his badge, Derek lunged toward the table where the evidence drive lay beside Marisol's laptop. It was a desperate, foolish motion, born of a man still believing that if he could touch the thing accusing him, he could change what it said. Reed moved from 3 steps away and caught him by the forearm. Again, there was no violence beyond necessity. A turn, a lock, a controlled lowering of Derek's hand to the table. Derek cursed, twisted, and tried to swing with his free arm, but Reed pinned him without striking back. "Stop fighting," Reed said, not unkindly. "You're making it worse." Something about that sentence broke the last of Derek's performance. He sagged against the table, breathing hard, and the confession came out in fragments. He had been passed over for chief operating officer. He had debts nobody knew about. He had convinced himself Vivian owed him. He had told himself selling data was not betrayal because Hartwell would survive and because he deserved compensation for years of being, in his words, used. Even then, bitterness found one final target. He looked at Reed with wet, furious eyes. "You don't belong here. You're a nobody in a thrift store jacket, and she listened to you over me." Reed released him when security took hold. "A jacket never made a man small," he said. "Power never made one decent." The words did not rise. They did not need to. Derek was escorted out past the same executives who had once laughed at his jokes, and none of them could meet his eyes. Vivian stood in the doorway of the operations room, the federal demonstration saved, her company intact, and felt no triumph. Only a sober recognition that the disaster had not begun with a breach or a shove. It had begun the first time someone cruel had been useful enough to excuse. By 3 o'clock, the federal demonstration had proceeded without interruption. By 3:10, police had taken Derek's formal statement. By 3:12, Vivian found Reed in the lobby, checking his watch with the focused concern of a man for whom the day's corporate earthquake ranked second behind school dismissal. She approached without entourage, without counsel, without the polished distance she had used for years as armor. "Mr. Harlan." He turned, tired enough now that the lines around his eyes showed. "I need to go." "I know." She held out an envelope. "Compensation for today. For the Marlowe, too. And an apology, though I understand if that matters less." Reed did not take the envelope right away. Apologies matter when they change what happens next. Vivian accepted that. "Then I'll make sure it does." Her voice caught, barely. "I allowed a man like Derek to become powerful in my company because he was efficient and because confronting him would have been inconvenient. That failure reached you, Nora, my staff, and nearly people who depend on our systems during emergencies. I am sorry." Reed studied her for a moment. He was used to corporate apologies shaped like escape routes. This one did not seem to be looking for a door. "Thank you," he said, and took the envelope only after she added, "Your time has value." He made it to South Gate with 2 minutes to spare. Junie climbed into the truck and immediately noticed the visitor badge clipped to his jacket. "Did you go to a fancy building?" "Pretty fancy." "Did they have snacks?" "Probably. I missed them." She gave him a look of deep disappointment on his behalf. That evening, while Junie painted cardboard gates blue for her science fair model, Reed opened the envelope and found more money than he expected, plus a handwritten note from Vivian offering him an independent consulting contract, flexible hours, limited exposure, no press, no internal politics, authority over the work he accepted, and complete respect for his family schedule. He read it twice. Junie, who was pretending not to watch him, asked, "Is it bad?" "No." "Is it good?" Reed looked around the small kitchen, the chipped mug by the sink, Lila's photograph near the stove, the inhaler box on the counter, the electric bill held to the refrigerator by a magnet shaped like Missouri. "It might be." Junie came to stand beside him, smelling faintly of tempera paint and dish soap. "Would you still pick me up?" He folded the letter carefully. "Always." That answer came faster than any decision he had made all day. In the weeks that followed, Hartwell changed in ways that did not make headlines, but mattered more than headlines. Derek's allies were investigated, and several resigned before they could be dismissed. Vendor exceptions required dual approval. Assistants who had endured quiet humiliation were asked, privately and respectfully, to tell the truth about what they had seen. Nora received a formal apology and a renewed contract for the Marlowe, but Vivian made sure the agreement could not be used by any future executive as leverage against her staff. Reed accepted the consulting position on his own terms. He came in through the side entrance twice a week, reviewed systems, trained engineers, and left before school pickup. At first people stared, then they learned not to. Competence has a way of making clothing irrelevant. He never spoke of his military years unless a lesson required it. He never allowed anyone to turn him into a legend. When a young engineer apologized for assuming he was just a repair guy, Reed told him, "Repair is honest work. Don't put just in front of it." The sentence traveled quietly through Hartwell until it became something like a rule. Vivian found reasons to attend his briefings and then stopped pretending they were accidental. What grew between them was not sudden romance, not the easy fairy tale gratitude people might have expected from a story told badly. It was slower and more serious than that. She saw him leave a board-level security review mid-discussion because Junie's school nurse called about wheezing, and instead of frustration, she felt respect settle deeper. He saw Vivian sit with a dismissed receptionist for 20 minutes after learning Derek had once threatened her job, and he understood that apology, in her hands, had become action. They spoke often, but never about destiny or debts. They spoke about systems, responsibility, grief, children, weather, Lila's old garden, Vivian's father, and the strange loneliness of being trusted by many people while being truly known by almost none. Once, after a late meeting ran long, Vivian offered to send a car so Reed would not miss Junie's science fair. Reed declined the car, but accepted Vivian's help carrying the cardboard Riverlock model into the gym when a sudden rainstorm soaked the parking lot. Junie took one look at Vivian's expensive coat, then at the blue paint streak on her sleeve from where the model had rubbed against her arm, and whispered to Reed, "She doesn't seem stuck up." Reed leaned down. "Good observation." Vivian pretended not to hear, but her smile gave her away. Spring arrived slowly in St. Louis, with cold mornings, bright afternoons, and rain that left the streets shining under traffic lights. On a Saturday in April, the Marlowe's West Lounge reopened after a small renovation Nora had wanted for years. The brass lamps were polished, the old wiring replaced, and a narrow shelf near the entrance held a small wooden sign carved by Nora's brother. "Every person who walks in here matters. No names, no scandal, no explanation. People who knew understood. People who did not know still read it and stood a little kinder at the counter." Reed came before opening to check the final panel, Junie trailing behind him with a book under one arm and Henry the plastic horse in her coat pocket. She had grown comfortable in the lounge by then, comfortable enough to sit at a corner table and draw while her father worked, though she still watched strangers carefully until they proved themselves safe. Vivian arrived without assistance, wearing jeans, a navy sweater, and the same coat now carrying a faint blue paint mark that had never fully come out. Nora hugged her, which would have startled Vivian months earlier and did not startle her now. Reed looked up from the panel. "Morning, morning," Vivian said. Nothing in the exchange announced what had changed between them, but something had. Respect had become ease. Ease had become trust. Junie waved her pencil. Vivian waved back with solemn dignity, as though greeting a head of state. A man at the counter recognized Reed from the rumors and began to say something admiring, but Nora caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. So the man only nodded, paid for his coffee, and left Reed his peace. That was the respect Reed preferred, not applause, not speeches, not people digging through his wounds for inspiration, but ordinary decency restored to its proper place. When he finished, he joined Vivian and Junie near the window. Nora brought coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for Junie, extra whipped cream because Nora believed children deserved small luxuries whenever life allowed them. For a while, they talked about Junie's science fair ribbon, Hartwell's new apprenticeship program for trade school students, and whether Nora should add peach pie to the summer menu. Nobody mentioned Derek. His name had become unnecessary. Later, when Junie went to examine the pastry case, Vivian looked across the table at Reed. The morning light softened the scar near his eyebrow and silvered the worn creases in his jacket. "I think about that day more than I expected," she said. Reed turned his coffee cup slowly between both hands. "The Marlowe? The shove. The silence after. How many people decided who you were before you ever spoke? He glanced toward Junie, who was negotiating with Nora as if pastry selection were a matter of national policy. People do that saves them the trouble of knowing better. Vivian nodded, accepting the gentleness and the rebuke inside it. I did it too. Reed did not rescue her from the truth, but he did not punish her with it either. You changed course, only after harm was done. Most people don't even do it then. Outside, a bus sighed at the curb. Rainwater dripped from the awning in bright, steady threads. Vivian folded her hands around her cup. When Derek said you were nothing, I thought you would finally get angry. Reed's eyes remained on his daughter. I was angry. You didn't show it. I've got a child watching how I carry things. That makes a man careful. Junie returned with a blueberry muffin the size of her hand and placed it between them as though sharing it had always been the plan. Reed broke it into 3 pieces. Vivian accepted hers, and for a moment the 3 of them sat in the kind of quiet that asks for nothing. Around them, the lounge filled with ordinary Saturday sounds, spoons against cups, low conversation, the soft thump of Nora's register drawer, rain ticking against glass. Reed was still the same man who had walked in months earlier with a tool bag and a deadline. He had not become louder, richer in spirit, or more worthy because executives finally recognized him. His worth had been there the whole time, in the lunch notes folded like stars, in the restraint of open hands, in work done correctly when nobody important was watching, in the refusal to let another man's cruelty decide the shape of his own character. The people at the Marlowe understood that now. Vivian understood it. Junie had known it all along. And Reed, sitting by the window with his daughter beside him and rain silvering the city beyond the glass, did not need to say a word to prove that quiet dignity can outlast humiliation, that truth can walk into a polished room wearing scuffed boots, and that the strongest man there may be the one who never raises his voice. Sometimes the most powerful reminder of integrity arrives wearing scuffed boots and a jacket held together by a paperclip. When senior executive Derek Hollis publicly shoved the hotel repairman, no one guessed that the quiet stranger was Reed Harlan, a man who had once carried a wounded teammate through a burning stairwell. Reed's calm warning and measured restraint proved a truth we often forget. Real strength protects rather than punishes, and never needs to shout. That moment split the polished veneer of the room and forced CEO Vivian Hartwell to confront the arrogance she had tolerated in her ranks. Because Reed answered cruelty with dignity, a corrupt power play collapsed, lives were safeguarded, and an entire corporate culture began to change. The lesson is urgent and simple. Never judge worth by a title or a suit. Measure it by how someone treats the people they could ignore. Carry that humility into every hallway and you will make space for courage, kindness, and justice to breathe. If Reed's example hit home for you, tell me which moment spoke the loudest in the comments below. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder. And smash that subscribe button so our community of everyday heroes keeps growing.